discussion on politicizing history, concepts to documentation, interpretation, and teachings of Indian history. So each panelist is required to discuss on the topic for 15 to 18 minutes. And now, without any further ado, let me introduce the panelists for today. We have Dr. Gitanjali Surendra, who is a professor at Jindal Global Law School and also an executive director for Center for Law and Humanities. We have Dr. Ravikant Mishra, who is a deputy director at Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And we have Dr. Mahmood Kuria, who is a researcher at Leiden University and a visiting faculty at Ashoka University. Faculty at Ashoka. Now Sahil will explain the topic briefly.
Okay, so the first time this particular topic, history per se, came up in our team board meeting was when Professor Dipanshu mentioned about how Amit Shah had spoken about how the Indian history had to be seen from a nationalistic point of view. And that was quite worrying, so I looked into it, like what is it exactly? And then there, Amit Shah had spoken, I'll just take one particular case study, and that was his view on Tipu Sultan. So usually you'd view him as someone who stood up against the British, but Amit Shah, and I'm not bringing any political tangent into this, but like he saw it as someone who committed a lot of atrocities in the name of Islam. So here you need to question yourself, whether history, the thing we see it as, is it really innocent, you see? And now one more, on a much more global context, I've looked at the case of Viktor Orban from Hungary, how he's viewing the current Muslim refugees, not as refugees, but as invaders. So you can see that, they're generating a historical backing to execute their current political narrative. So I'm going to leave it over there. Of course, panelists have a much more nuanced view and opinion than mine. If you see the screen right now, those are different questions for this particular panel. And I will forward the further of this debate to the panel, starting with Professor, who would like to go first?
It's okay, I can start now.
Okay, Professor. Yeah. You have 10 to 15 minutes. At 12 minutes, I'll be giving you a chit, and just to wrap up.
He said 18 minutes.
No. So basically, what they do is generally give you an idea. If you have if you want to be notified that you have 3 to 4 minutes.
That I would want.
That is
yeah, fine.
It gives me immense pleasure to be back here at Jindal. This is the institution I love, and I'm teaching a course also, an elective course on Gandhi. So I'm really delighted to be here, and I'm grateful to the Political Society for inviting me here and to be back with colleagues like Gitanjali, Dipanshu, and Samrat, and so many others. And especially I love to be with students because they are the ones who ask really difficult questions. When you are with your peers, generally the questions are not as courageous as they are when you are with students. So, in fact, it always makes me more nervous when I give a talk, before students. I think your format is that I have to take up one of the 3 questions and focus on it. So, after a lot of thinking, I thought that I should focus on the first question. And as he said, this first question occurred, this debate rather, came to his mind because Mr. Amit Shah made a statement that history should be written from the Indian perspective, and there was a debate about Tipu Sultan. So in fact, this is what I see as the first major issue that historians and historiography have to face, not just in India but everywhere else. There have been attempts for a very long time now to write history or to rewrite history from clearly ideological perspectives, whatever the particular perspective might be. And this has led to a situation in which for a lot of lay people it is difficult to understand what our past represents. Now, among the historians, there may be a more complex, more nuanced approach. But so far as non-historians are concerned, in simple language one can say they are often puzzled as to what history is. If it can be written from so many different perspectives, how to judge what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And Tipu Sultan, of course, is one example of it, how he has been cast into this binary of hero versus villain. Maybe the reality is something, between these two extremes. We should be open to that possibility. Having said that, I'm not trying to say that history writing can be totally dissociated from politics or should be totally dissociated from politics. But my perspective would be that history writing as such should be left largely to historians, professional historians, though the debate about the past is something, which should involve the entire society. And the professional historians should be open to the suggestions from the rest of the society about what history is, how to see history. But at the same time, history, like any other discipline, has its own norms, it has its methods, it has its philosophy, etc., etc., things which require a certain training. It's like you cannot become a shooter without training, you cannot become an archer without training, you cannot become an athlete without training. So what makes people think that you can become a historian without any training? Right? So you may have a view about the past. When I say you, I mean people who are non-historians. It could be Mr. Amit Shah, it could be anybody else for that matter. So people may have their views about the past, but are these views the same as professionally written history? That is something that we have to distinguish. You see, one very important problem that I see in the post-colonial historiography in India in the last 70 years is, apart from its politicization, is that it follows a very, very clearly teleological sort of approach to history writing. You see, what do I mean by this teleology thing? Just because something is important for you in the present, for example, harmony is important for you in the present, women's rights are important for you in the present, secularism is important for you in the present, democracy is important for you in the present, minority rights are important for you in the present, which is all very good. But the problem is that when we try to go back to the past and discover these things in the past, sometimes in the distant past, I come across people who try to find women's rights in Kabir or all kinds of things, democracy, peaceful coexistence, secularism in Akbar. Even Amartya Sen more or less does that, maybe not so explicitly in his book The Argumentative Indian. So I find it problematic, because my belief is that by and large history should be studied for the sake of pleasure, by and large. Not for instrumentality of, trying to fix it to the present in some way and saying that just because we want to be like this, we have to prove that we were like this. No, we don't have to prove like that. You see, there are certain values which we in modern India or in the modern world adhere to, not necessarily because they are derived from the past. They may or may not be derived from the past. I'm not saying that this should not be studied at all. It is all right if you want to study it, as long as your effort is not instrumental in nature. You learn it, you try to understand the past for its own sake largely, and see the connections between the past and the present. That is a valid historiographical exercise. But on the other hand, when you try to establish a clear link between what the past was, what the political trends in the past were, and what the trends are now, it is a hazardous kind of exercise for me. You see, it reminds me of the great great Marxist historian R.S. Sharma, for example. A very great historian. But you see, all his life he kept working on proving that Indian history has the same kind of structural, has the same structure as European history has. For example, feudalism. Because feudalism existed in Europe, and because feudalism is a universal category for him, of course, which has been contested by Harbans Mukhia and others, then feudalism must have existed in India also. And if feudalism did not exist in the same way as it existed in Europe, he called it Indian feudalism. So now, what is the meaning of Indian feudalism? Then some people translated it as Bharatiya Samantavad. But is Samantavad the same as feudalism? Again, so there is no end to this debate. So probably the best thing is to situate the present in a different framework, not by denying the links between the past and the present, acknowledge these links, but also accept the fact that teleological history is both dangerous and problematic, and it plays into the hands of those who are the enemies of peace, tolerance, etc., etc. If I dare say, you see, this Ram Janmabhoomi decision is going to come very soon. Now, I remember very well in early 1990s and late 80s, and I'm from Uttar Pradesh, Kanpur. So I was there then. I have seen the movement, in its full, whatever you call it, heat of the moment. So I remember many things. So Babri Masjid Action Committee and this Ram Janmabhoomi movement, they were, they had I think a set of discussions on both sides. There were archaeologists, historians, etc. And the historians who were leading from the Babri Masjid Action Committee side, they were all from my university, JNU, where I came later, obviously not at that time. The 27 leading historians of JNU, they had played the leading role in it. Now, what I could not understand it then, as it was happening in 1989-90, but when I came to JNU, and by that time I could understand, these things, and I could see that, the basic problem in the argument that was being given by those who wanted to uphold secular values and tolerance and peace, etc., was that they had premised their argument on the contentious issue of historical evidence, on the issue of whether or not a mosque had been demolished. And they were asking these people to give evidence. Okay. Now this I find a fundamentally flawed approach. In fact, this I have discussed with many of my professors at JNU at that time. I have a continuous dialogue with them. Even now I keep meeting them and I keep discussing this. It is flawed because the moment you say that present can be changed because the past had evidence of a particular kind, you fall into a trap. Because even if it cannot be conclusively proved that a temple had been demolished in Ayodhya in order to build the mosque, Mir Baqi had done it, there can be many other examples that you can find, there is no doubt about them. You can look at the Quwwatul Islam Mosque, for example, in Delhi. You can look at other things. But the point is, are we going to right the historical wrongs, whatever they are? Is our modern republic based upon righting those wrongs? That is the relevant question, in my opinion, that needs to be asked. And that is why I am critical of this approach of, writing history in an instrumentalist way, trying to somehow establish that, we are secular, we are tolerant, we give rights to the minorities because we were like this. It is at best a tenuous connection in my eyes. So we should be wary of these kind of things. Now the problem is that our intelligentsia and our if I can say the leaders of our society have also not been careful enough when it comes to this. You see, the problem is that on the one hand we argue that historical wrongs have to be righted. Now this is the case. Now I'll tell you, because this is a very frank discussion here. Probably these are not the things that you can discuss in larger forums, but this is I hope and I understand this is a very enlightened place and it's a different kind of gathering. I very well remember this OBC reservation issue also when VP Singh launched it. And VP Singh launched it, and it was argued then, and it is argued even now, that it is a historical wrong that has to be righted. Because OBCs were discriminated against, they were oppressed, etc., etc. Now, quite apart from the fact of whether there is historical evidence of their being oppressed or discriminated against or not, let us leave that aside for the moment. My point is that if you are saying that because some community, some group was wronged in the past, could be 500 years ago, 1000 years ago. The society has to compensate for it now. What stops the Hindu nationalists or Islamic fundamentalists or other people who are reactionaries in all kinds of ways from asserting that they were wronged in the past and therefore they must be compensated? That is a very problematic situation. Because you see, after all, people have different takes on the past. They have different value systems also. So unless we can say that, look, it is only in the case of glaring oppression and glaring discrimination, like it happened in the case of the untouchables in India, the black slavery in the Americas, etc. This historical compensation is probably not something that we should go for, unless we can say that there is no end to these sectarian demands of all kinds of trying to change the past, because your values have changed in the present or because you believe in a certain thing. Now, my point is that history by its very nature is a contested territory. I think most historians today would understand and accept that there is no one historical truth. I cannot go with postmodernism to the extent of saying that there is nothing like historical truth. I cannot say that fact and fiction are the same, as some people argue. I do believe that there are things that are truer than others. I don't think that fact and fiction are not different. They are different. But yes, I do accept the fact that there can be multiple narratives of the past. My only point is, and this is the challenge that we are facing now in this so-called post-truth society, that untruth is masquerading as truth. Falsehood is masquerading as truth. This is what I object to. You see, history is not fiction. History can have different perspectives. It can have different narratives. Nevertheless, it remains history. It has to correspond to evidence. It has to correspond to facts. In that sense, I remain an old-fashioned historian, meaning that you may have different perspectives. You may give your own interpretation, whatever it is. But you cannot give an interpretation which has nothing to do with facts, for which you cannot find sufficient evidence. So within that larger constraint of evidence, you can have different narratives about the past. Now, one thing, now we all understand, in a drama, for example, in a drama, for example, the most important character generally is the protagonist, isn't it? And drama is what? It is a story after all, and in some sense history is also a story, past is also a story, or maybe multiple stories. Now in the case of drama, how do we look upon the plot? We look upon the plot generally from the point of view of the protagonist, not from the point of view of the antagonist. Take the case of Ramayana. Now, most of us, whether we read the Ramayana or not, whether we are interested in Sanskrit or not, we look at it from the point of view of the protagonist. And the point of view of the protagonist teaches us that you must not kidnap someone's wife and then refuse to return her and or go into a war and so on and so forth. That is the perspective that we get from the protagonist. Now suppose we look at the story of Ramayana, at Ramkatha, from the perspective of Ravan. What is Ravan's perspective? Ravan's perspective is also there. His perspective is that you can kidnap or steal someone else's wife and refuse to return even if you are killed in the process. Now somebody might say that even that is a perspective, but history is not completely devoid of its moral and universal values. You see, those who are saying that all values are equal, I'm sorry, I have to disagree with them. There are certainly things which are flexible, there are things which are particularistic, which exist in their time and space, but there are things at the same time which are of universal value, and we must understand those universal things. And we another example that I can cite to you in this regard is that of the great play of Shakespeare, Othello. Those of you who have read Othello will recall that Iago is the arch villain. Shakespeare's worst villain or the greatest villain is Iago, who confuses this man Othello, conspires against him, and because he was jealous of his high position, that of a commander, and he poisons his ear so much that he ends up killing his wife out of jealousy, Desdemona. Now, and in the end, and the important thing that Shakespeare does here is that Iago does it all without any real motive, by the way, because he is a villain. He sees the right as wrong and the wrong as right, as the witches say in Macbeth, fair is foul, foul is fair, hover through the wind and fill the air. That sort of thing, inversion of all values. So and in the end, when he is asked about it, Iago, why did you do it? He refuses to say anything. So that's a great act of villainy. You find it there in the case of Othello also. So what is important is to concede the possibility that past can be understood in multiple ways, but avoid, explicit politicization of the past, and past should largely be left for people who are trained to work on it, though people have a stake in it. I'm not saying that I would not be ready to listen to the voices of those who are not trained historians. All the time I keep interacting, I learn from them, and in fact, very often I develop insights by talking to people who are not historians at all. But at the same time, we should not allow and we cannot allow the discipline of history or historiography or the narrative about the past to be taken over by those who do not have a broader understanding of the past. That is where the problem lies. Different, like I come across, I was delivering a lecture on Gandhi in one of the colleges in Delhi University, and a student asked me, sir, if Gandhi was so good, why did Nathuram Godse kill him? Nathuram Godse did so much for freedom struggle. So I had to ask him, please tell me, what did Nathuram Godse do for freedom struggle? In freedom struggle, did he play any role after all? So this kind of propagandist history which is going around, I'm sorry, we cannot accept that all this propaganda is the same as professional historiography. You see, the differences among historians are professional differences, based on evidence and perspective and interpretation of facts. But that operates within a frame of reference. It cannot operate outside it. But you see that explicit politicization of history in which you have a certain agenda which you want to serve, whatever your ideology or agenda might be, and you write history explicitly with the aim of deriving legitimacy for the present from the past, that I find deeply problematic, and which is, I think, probably the biggest challenge that history writing is facing today in this post-truth world, because one thing that we see is that truth has become dispensable. Two, theory has taken over history. This has become a very big, theory has taken over history. Whereas history in the end is a subject that actually does not fit very well with history, unlike political science, sociology, economics, etc., etc. The fact is, or at least my opinion is, that all grand theories, they are tested in the crucible of history and generally they fail. History is not about theory. History is ultimately about evidence, about method of how to understand the past, and therefore all grand theorization must be avoided. Postmodernism has made an important contribution by saying that there can be multiple truths, and I concede that possibility, but at the same time judging history devoid of evidence and facts and solely on the basis of some theory and saying that one person is as right as the other person, that is something that I cannot accept. That's where we have to draw the line between Ram and Ravan, between Othello and Iago, or between Ram and Vali also. So that is a distinction we must accept, and it is a very big challenge because the past has become deeply politicized and contested. Have I completed my time?
Yes, Professor.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor.
So can we go? Then we go for going or please go ahead. Okay, why don't you and then we'll have. Good, please proceed.
All right. Given Ashoka a couple of months ago, this first time I'm talking in a Jindal's venue where I haven't talked at all at Ashoka so far. But still, this is a great topic, and I'm not very much an expert reflect on different questions that have been raised here, particularly my research hasn't been much on the just before. All right. So, but still, I'll try to address two of these questions on the basis of the research that I have been doing and a bit of teaching that I have been doing. I haven't taught, to be honest, in India on the Indian history, but mostly what I have been teaching is on the, before joining Ashoka in Netherlands on the history of the Indian Ocean world. Before I go to that, I will briefly introduce myself so that you would know what kind of take or the context about which I am talking about. So I did originally come from Kerala, and I did my bachelor's in history on history of Kerala, and for my master's and MPhil, I did ancient Indian history, and for my PhD, I did history of the Indian Ocean world and Mediterranean world with a specific focus on Islamic law or legal history. So the first one I did it in Kerala itself. The second, that is bachelor's and master's, I did it. Bachelor, master's and MPhil I did in JNU, Center for Historical Studies. I just realized that all three of us are from JNU, right? Yeah. So and my PhD I did it.
From the ground for another conspiracy.
That's right. Yeah. So, and I did my PhD at Leiden University Institute for History. So I started with history of Kerala, then moved to what you could say history of ancient India, and then when I had with more sort of a medieval, from the categorization or that we have prevalent or predominant in India, early medieval to modern history. Because I was looking at circulation of one law book from 9th century to 19th century, cutting across different geography and time. So I'm saying this because, the kind of points that I would like to take kind of relates to, some of the training that I myself have went through. So broadly, two sections that I would like to, spend my remaining time, 8 minutes each, if I have that much. One is about the larger context, and towards the second part, I would suggest, or I would raise 8 points related to the larger two questions, as well as the history writing and the politicization of history. On this topic, I would like to take, on the first part, I would like to take a step back and think in the larger context in which the history writing in the last 60, 70 years after the independence has been, as previous panelists pointed out, it has been very contentious exercise in which a lot of stakeholders from different corners raise different stakes and concerns. So in this context, I always feel not only in the Indian historiography, but history at large, I feel like standing on a shore in front of a vast ocean without realizing where, or a bit of afraid whether should I enter the ocean or should I stand in the beach, and confused but still mesmerized by the beauty of the ocean, that is history. So largely I see three streams of history in the last, not just in the Indian context, but largely. One is the theoreticians who kind of engage with the historical method, the way history should be or ought to be written. And there are many, one theoretician, so to speak, or one philosopher of history that kind of always fascinated me is Haddon White. His last book just before his death is called The Practical Past, where basically he criticizes all the professional historians, saying that the professional historians shouldn't remain in their ivory tower, should rather address the kind of popular history or practical past that he says. For example, if I one of the examples that he says, one person, if he has to drive a car, he himself is making use of the knowledge that he or she had studied before. So every person on an everyday basis is making use of some sort of past that the person had went through. And similarly, every person is engaging a construction of the past and use and reuse of the past in different ways. Those who are familiar with Hayden White's writings would know that he is mostly interested in the literature, the divide between fiction writing and history writing. And he has very fascinating quotes where he criticizes, or even engages basically saying that every historical writing, every professional historian's writing is a construction of, a fiction. And there isn't much difference between the fictional writing and the historical writing on a number of different grounds. So largely speaking, not just Hayden White, but the larger theoretical engagements with history is something that that has been very significant in the last at least 40 years, where there has been a large breakaways from the ways in which modernist or modern history has been working. And the second one, which doesn't much address the theoretical engagement with the history, is the professional historians, or the tribe called professional historians, who engage with a number of different aspects of history without necessarily engaging theoretically with what their discipline or their engagement with the past has been or should be. And very rarely I have seen historians engage theoretically what their discipline should be. And this is not just like their own engagement, but generally, the theoretical or the historical methodology or the philosophy of history itself has become a subdiscipline within the field. And there are specific journals for that, which no one, the general historians or the general professional historians hardly read. And vice versa. The empirical historians, their work rarely addresses what the theoretical or philosophical historians engage with. So there is a big divide between these two. And if you look at, for example, I don't want to name any historians in India, but some of the works that I did for my master's, and I was fascinated by some of their writings while I was doing ancient Indian history. I happened to read some of these works after, let's say, 7 years after I finished my PhD. And I was kind of not moved, but like surprised the way, you construct the history of ancient India while being completely, not unaware, but at least inattentive towards the kind of theoretical engagements that has been there in the discipline that you claim to define for. So that is a big divide, and therefore the third category, that is the popular historians. Historians, the second category, always defend against the third category, the popular historians, who might be coming from all sort of different backgrounds, as my Ravikant sir was just saying that, anyone who not necessarily have a background in history cannot write history, because that needs its own skills and patterns. But what is the major problem with that is, the popular historians do not give a care, doesn't care about what professional historians or the philosophers of history say. So because it has a particular motive, and therefore it addresses that kind of concerns, and it doesn't translate into what what professional historians always defend for their discipline doesn't translate to what popular historians aim for. They have different propagandas or agendas that they immediately address to. And Hayden White's kind of one thing that I am suspicious of Hayden White and other postmodernist theoreticians or philosophers of history is that their argument in a way feeds into what popular historians do. But on the other way, on another ground, you could say, for example, Dibesh Chakravarti's engagement on the context of the South African apartheid and museums and the public history, what he calls the public history, where they engage with the different sorts of whether museums or popular writers and public memory and all these sort of things contribute to the making of a public history. So public history and popular history, again, something that is very interesting in the long run. As an outsider or someone who is not taking a stand, an ideological stand, saying that history should be this and or history shouldn't be that, and should we allow this and shouldn't we allow that. So having said these three, in these three categorization, once we look at the history of, or the way historical writing has developed in the last 60, 70 years after the independence, is something very interesting. We see major trends in the history of India, or the historiography of India. There has been, the colonial historians or Orientalist historians, such as starting with James Mill and so forth, and then you have these nationalist historians, right, who basically constructed a nationalist narrative of India. And then after the independence, many of the historians, particularly from different classes and backgrounds and ideological inclinations, constructed or demanded for a different way of writing that is different from both colonial as well as the nationalist historical approach. And therefore, something that they, so these were the three, or at least we can identify as the three major trends in the historical writing. The major problem with the first colonial historical writing, that it has categorized the history into three major streams. That is like the Hindu ancient history, the Hindu or the Hindu period, and the Muslim period, and the British period, which the nationalist historians questioned, but still emphasized or re-emphasized the same category. They said they shouldn't be polarized, but still they stuck to that kind of division in terms of the Hindu, Muslim, and British period. And eventually that had led to the something like two national theories or two nation states. One, the Muslim Pakistan, and then the what shouldn't be the Hindu India. So historically, these two streams also had contributed in terms of a nationalist historical writing. In the post-independent or post-colonial India, or the independent India, what historians had strived for is not to engage, or not to, or basically not to construct this Hindu identification of India. While there was a large group of historians, or what could be identified as the popular historians, who claimed for a unitary, monolithic idea of India as a Hindu nation, whereas many historians, from professional historians, called for more, diverse or more complicated nuances of the history, and then they strived for that kind of writing. So, but still, it's that their project has been very problematic. I would say it has been very parochial, very insular, in a number of different grounds. What all these historians had tried, I'm not again pointing out to any particular names, but still, all of them, what had they strived for had been to construct a particular narrative of the nation, whether, okay, thank you. So particular identity for nation. Definitely they were questioning the nationalist narrative of their predecessors, the nationalist historians, but still what they ended up constructing is the same sort of nationalist framework. If you look at, like, for example, the textbooks that had been circulated or taught for the last, not immediately in the last 10 years, but the, from 1960s onward until 2000, where you had, this, for example, textbooks such as Ancient India, Medieval India, Modern India, or even the institutions, all re-emphasizing the same sort of category while constructing India. They were questioning the temporality in terms of, or the chronological divisions in terms of ancient, medieval, modern, as Hindu, Muslim, and British, but still they constructed, or they stuck to what India should be. And this is very problematic in many grounds. Simultaneously, it discarded the regional differences within within the subcontinent, and on the other hand, it imagined a nation that didn't exist under the time frame that they had been discussing. Right. Post 1947, you have the geographical boundary that is called India, vis-a-vis Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, whereas for medieval or modern period or pre-modern period at large, you not necessarily had that kind of geopolitical boundary as it is defined. Still, you have a textbook called Ancient India, which not necessarily address that kind of thing. So on the basis, so what in that kind of historical approach, missing is the global historical approach. India in itself, all the comparisons and connections of the continent or the subcontinent called India was forgotten. And this, kind of what I would say, backlash as a ultra right-wing nationalist thinking, particularly for the nationalist historical approaches in a number of different. It's a nuanced argument. I can come back to it in the discussions. But on the basis of that, on the basis of these things, I would quickly go into 8 points in the 4 minutes that I have, spending maybe a half a minute on each. One is that, basically reiterating some of the points that I had mentioned. One is that the nationalist framework or the national framework, at least I am not, I'm not calling them nationalists, but at least a national framework and a soul searching for what is India. And then on the basis of as Romila Thapar once writes, while she was writing the textbooks for India post or independent India, they all involved, to quote her, involved in the building of a nation and implanting of new ideas. So that was the you had to construct this nation on the basis of what has been there. So you might be criticizing the whole boundaries and themes and notions and all sort of different things, but you still stick to what India is about. And she also says that their main attempt, particularly vis-a-vis after the partition, was not to identify professional historians. The attempt of professional historians was to prevent India becoming a Hindu state. So, and the question in front of them was, if not Hindu, then what sort of different identities can stand for India? So multiple ideas and debates evolved on the basis of different methodologies. However, no one seems to question the national framework or facilitated the extra-national or extra-regional research. And second point is that historians themselves were divided according to this framework in terms of for example, historians of Muslim background always or mostly would do medieval history, while the historians of other background or Hindu background would do ancient or ancient history mainly, while the modern is a realm of the both. So this is probably primarily because of the skills and tools that the historians are equipped with before they enter the discipline itself. So that kind of feed into the kind of historical narratives that they mainly deal with. And the institutions, the third aspect is the institutions. All the institutions of different sort, whether it's NCRT or the different universities, all sort of contributed to the same kind of narrative. So, for example, just to take JNU, which is one of the leading institutions for the history of history, constructed again the ancient, medieval, modern history, which both in terms of admission of students as well as appointment of faculty members, strictly divided this category and kind of discouraged cross-cutting of or chronological or trans-regional cross borders or transgressions, so to speak. So and this kind of influenced all over across the country. You could see in terms of textbooks also, for example, NCRT, whatever they make it, it is still the same sort of following ancient, medieval, modern categorization. And one thing that they claimed, or some of the historians who engaged in the post-nationalist historiography, is that they wanted to move away from this categorization by looking at different themes, such as social history, economic history, cultural history, and so forth. But still, while you do that, you still stick to the larger umbrella, which is still divided according to the old narratives or nationalist narrative. So the fourth point is the textbooks. Textbooks basically functioned as a tool for the other categories. I'll come back to that maybe in the discussions if there are more. So the trichotomy of the old Hindu, Muslim, British, or the ancient, medieval, modern kind of was re-emphasized. And then the fourth point is this construction of nation vis-a-vis the region and the subcultures. Now you have these, after 1950s, you have the new provinces or new states divided according to states. And these states started to have their own history. As I was saying, I did for my bachelor's, Kerala history, where I didn't study much Indian history, so to speak. And this, I assume that this is the case with many of the, state schools, state or provincial universities, where they will be teaching mostly history of, let's say, Haryana or Kashmir or, Punjab or sort of thing, where you not necessarily engage with the larger framework of, national history or even transnational history. And this goes both ways, both regional as well as trans-regional. And the the sixth point is language. Language is a major disadvantage in which both advantage and disadvantage for both regional, trans-regional, national, transnational histories, where you kind of cling to what the kind of languages you know. Whereas for historians, the major tool is the language that he or she is equipped with. And if you don't, and this is whoever looks at, for example, let's take all the historians who wrote, the kind of, let's say, the national histories, or the ancient India, or ancient or medieval India, and so forth. Mostly, I must say that they all mostly come from North India, and just check out the ways in which they deal with, let's say, South Indian history or Northeastern Indian history, where rarely, despite of writing a so-called professional history, hardly engage with any primary sources in the primary languages. So the kind of history that you build up for the so-called nation is very limited in that sense. And simultaneously, it also goes the other way around for the regional histories, where you, let's say, for a person who is trained in Kerala history in Kerala, will be speaking mainly of that region itself without engaging with the national histories. And that dimension also goes to the larger way of learning history. While Indian historical writing and historical learning became very much parochial or insular, it evaded or erased all sort of different possibilities of doing languages, other languages, for example, Malay or any Chinese, in order to study history. And you do study this history only on the basis of, vis-a-vis Indian history. You might briefly engage with the history of Pakistan or Afghanistan only whenever it fits into your narrative. And that is a very problematic aspect. Therefore, it kind of, limits the ways in which the history of India has been built up in a different various. And therefore, what I would briefly suggest in the last two aspects is that one should more explore thematic histories, and that should be one university that at least strays towards is that the newly established Kriya University. I don't know whether you saw, where they try to engage. Whereas some of the universities, including my own university, Ashoka, still reemphasizes some of the old narratives or old schools that fits into the. And the last aspect I would emphasize is global history or trans-temporal or the trans-spatial, whether you call it world history, transnational history, whatever, it should be one major way where everyone feels like you are a global citizen, whether you do history professionally, popularly, or whatever, and therefore, and it raises a lot of different possibilities in terms of your own framework, especially in the rise of, while the nationalist, ultra-right-wing nationalist propagandas and ideologies become, very parochial, very, anti of any other things. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Is it already on?
Yeah.
About what I should, what I should be engaging with, and what would be most fruitful for this discussion. And I was just thinking, and then I only saw the title this morning, this politicization. This is the way in which I just jumped straight into the questions. And I was thinking, oh my God, but history is always political, right? I just don't, if there's one thing that's become very clear to me in my adult life, and there's been a substantial amount of it at this point, history is always political. And the reason I emphasize adult life is because I will actually like to speak about school textbooks for a reason. The other thing is there's a way in which there's history all around us. You were mentioning the Tipu Sultan issue, but all kinds of figures are being talked about now, right? Tipu Sultan, there's Basavanna, then every region has its own, of course, Shivaji. And I would say that Shivaji, the sort of revival of Shivaji as a figure is certainly something that's maybe about 2 decades old. It was in the works, but the way in which it's really taken off has been quite recent. Even the discussions around the film Padmavat, etc. So I think, and the ones that's going to come around Panipat, which is releasing next month, and then of course the Prithviraj Chauhan film, it's going to be exciting and and interesting in that sense. So there's a way in which we have history being discussed all the time. Unfortunately, history is also, or example, as Ravi was saying, history is also being invoked to provoke certain kinds of actions, some of which border on the violent or are violent. And I think the political stakes of history haven't probably never been as high as they are today. I'm still reminded, one of our professors, Tanika Sarkar, saying to a couple of us when we were in JNU, 20 odd years ago, that she, whenever she got on a plane, and the person next to her would ask her, what do you do, and she'd say, I'm a housewife. And well, what do you mean? You're one of the sort of big historians of the time and so on. And so we asked her why, and she said, if I tell them I'm a historian, they will start talking about history. And the rest of my plane ride will be spent talking about history. So I think in a strange way, and we always see the negative side of this, but I think there's a way in which we are very history or historically minded people, possibly because of the way we portray ourselves as having ancient roots and, for whatever reasons and, with all of its attendant problems. We're very historically minded people, even if we are not people who pay a great deal of attention to history, the discipline, right? A point that Pratap Bhanu Mehta is always making. So whether it's about the nation-state narrative, we've talked about nationalist history, whether it's about different types of community narratives around history, I think public and popular, there's probably some kind of a subtle distinction there, which also might be worth discussing a little bit later. Whether it's the history of communities that have so far been hidden from from larger historical narratives, or of course the histories of demolished monuments, monuments to come, monuments in the making, and I don't just mean actual material stuff. Here, I think we're surrounded by history. So that's something that's to bear in mind. All of it is not the kind, not the kind that has these murderous implications. Some of it is I think, history that we really do need to reckon with, and I'll just discuss that in a moment. One of the things that I think is, I was just thinking about, before this, in the last couple of months, I've been working on a school textbooks project, or at least a kind of a write-up for one. And I've also been writing about history and heritage for something else. And I was just thinking that, when we think about people's ideas of history, of course, one is, as Krishna Kumar says, one is, of course, your family, and you have your community narratives, family narratives, and so on. So there's that history that you, in a sense, grew up with, you're embedded in. It's not, none of this is critical history, of course, or history that is critical in any way. But you grew up with certain kinds of historical narratives about families, communities, and so on. But the other is school. And I come back to this because, in fact, in some ways, the most contested ground is, in terms of the discipline, is still the school textbooks. And I'm going to say, in just a few words, what I think are the issues with school textbooks and why, in fact, they're worthy of our continuing discourse around. Even though I have to say, when I first heard of a textbook controversy was when I just left school in 1997. And there was an ICHR issue and some leftist historians had been pushed out and so on. So that was the first time I heard about, it came to mind that the school textbook I was reading, or I had just read, had a certain political, take. And that's because school textbooks present history with a certain voice of authority. They also work on the principle of repetition. So you do it in class 2, and then 4, and then 6, and then 8, and then 10, and then 12. You'll do modern. Then you'll do medieval and ancient in the other years. 11, whatever, 9, 7, and so on. So there's a way in which, and of course there's school pedagogy, the way in which this history is taught, again as authoritative, as a kind of a single narrative. I'm not saying every textbook is like that. I'm really talking a little bit from personal experience, but also some things that I've seen. Of course, there are some exceptional enterprises as well in the area of textbook writing, but I think they remain the exception. So in my own time, for instance, I distinctly remember and this is very relevant for our current time when he's very much not the saint that he was thought of when I was growing up. Gandhi couldn't be referred to in our classroom except as Gandhiji. There was an order that was sent down from the principal that nobody should refer to Gandhi as Gandhi, but as Gandhiji. It has to be Mahatma Gandhi or Gandhiji. So the honorific was important. Luckily, we were just about getting out of Nehru as Chacha Nehru, but that was on the anvil. That was still there. It was still hovering in the air. The British were evil. Patel was good. Jinnah was bad. Freedom struggle was heroic and unqualified and undiminished in that regard. Partition was bad. Hinduism was tolerant. There were almost no workers, no women, no Dalits, no particular community. The kinds of ways in which the historical discipline, there calls for it to be more inclusive. That certainly wasn't the case with our history textbooks. So I often wonder, how does somebody who's not as lucky as I am to be a historian for life actually make sense of the world that we live in today with this education, right? So how do we think about Ambedkar? And he was very much relegated to as a father of the Constitution, and that's it. We didn't know anything else about him, and today it's almost like an overload. Ambedkar this, Ambedkar that, right? With good reason, I would say so. Please don't take that as a criticism. How would they make sense of Periyar, who was arguing for a Dravidian nation on the very eve of independence, right? He's suggesting that we should mourn independence, or from the perspective of his perspective in the South. How do we make sense of Sharad Bose, who's arguing for united Bengal? And how do we make sense of so many figures we know what happens with Bhima Koregaon, right? Or what's happening with Bhima Koregaon in fact, there's a very particular connotation being added to it or being lent to it precisely because it doesn't fit neatly into a typical school textbook nationalist status narrative, right? So how does somebody who's only grown up with this, with some talk of history perhaps in the community and the family, make sense of this hyper dense historical time that we're in, where history is being talked about and historical figures are being thrown about in so many different ways. So as Mehmood was saying, there are ways in which we can think about different types of history, right? So I add school history basically to your list because I think it's different, and I think it in a way, really the sense that most people have of Indian history comes from that longish period in one's life. Then there's, of course, the popular and public history. I think there's a difference there, but I'm bracketing it as one. It's also popular and public history. You'll see some myth and fact intertwining in certain ways, but you'll also see some interesting things happening. So, for instance, you have a narrative around a place like Konarak Temple, right, where if you go there, the local history is that there is the person who built Konarak Temple, who was the chief architect. His son visits him after 12 years, and then there's a lot of worry. His father's worried, everybody's worried that the king is going to be extremely angry and mete out punishment for the fact that the temple's running behind schedule. The construction's running behind schedule. So then the boy climbs up to the top of the temple and then does something to fix the problem. And then he throws himself into the sea, because the idea is that if the king knows that he did it and not his expert workman, whom he's hired to do the job, then they will pay anyway, and there'll be punishment. So it's a story of heroism. If you think about that as a popular history, there's also a way in which there's an insertion or reinsertion of labor and certain narratives of that otherwise are not part of our Konarak Temple narrative, right? So I think they're interesting. There's some reckoning we have to do with that, even though it's not. We must be very clear that it is not professional history, as Ravi was talking about. Then comes academic history, and Ravi, you made so many interesting points here as well. The Babri Masjid issue especially. I remember that 1989 pamphlet that came out. And in a sense, you're saying the question itself was problematic, right? Is there something under this that that was a temple, and are we going to right this historical wrong this way? And so the framework of the question is itself the problem. But academic history, as you again pointed out, and as Mehmood pointed out as well, also has its own ideological stick. So there's no doubt we do have our leftists, we have our nationalists. Again, even in JNU, we were not allowed to, in some classes, not allowed to call Gandhi Gandhi, but had to refer to him as Bapu, if I recall. And so they were... I don't remember that. Well, lucky you. So, there are moments when, of course, there's no doubt that even this nationalist history has its own ideological take. Sometimes it's very obvious, sometimes it's not. And I appreciate it when it's actually directly laid out, because I think that's the way forward, that you be quite clear about what your ideological take is, and there's no harm done. But the reader should be clear about this. It shouldn't take them till 500 pages to figure that out. I don't think it's required anymore. Now, as Krishna Kumar, the famous educationist, says, memories of the social past are critical components of what is passed down from adults to children, especially in schools, and help students gain a sense of their place in the world, in a world that existed before them and will continue to exist long after. All too often, as Nick Dirks reminds us, modern history writing becomes a form of state power and therefore inseparable from the needs and instrumentalities of the state. But here's where I think it gets really interesting. So, despite this statist effort, quite successful at one level, to impose a certain kind of nationalist narrative, in schools especially, around, and of course with its colonial hangover as well in terms of periodization and so on, there has always been pushback, I think. And especially in the 90s, once the Congress governments go, I think there is tremendous pushback, and I think in some ways that is the moment that, that really released certain types of energies, which Dipesh Chakrabarti is called the history wars, right? It leads to the history wars. So for me, there are two signature moments in the 90s they're not, one is a singular event, of course, and that is the demolition of the Babri Masjid, based on this dodgy historical argument, right? And again, the CHS historians said what they said, but they're roundly ignored, especially in a kind of popular forum. So worth thinking again, and Janki Nair has, and she's speaking today actually, has this sort of longish reflection on the on the sort of relationship between academic history and public history, and what that could be, especially in the context of her textbook section on the Nadars and their clothing debate in the 19th century. Secondly, the second is not a single moment, it's multiple moments, and that is the questioning of that nationalist narrative. So here I think, you know, the early 90s, sort of one of my enduring images of the early 90s, and I was quite young, so one's quite moved by things one's seeing, and you know, the world is opening up, suddenly there's lots on television, a way in which there wasn't earlier. And I remember the statue of Lenin being brought down just as in Moscow, just as the Soviet Union is sort of on its way out, it's collapsing. And I think of the entire 90s as a time when, in fact, finally Gandhi begins to be really questioned. And in fact, to some degree, it goes to the other extreme altogether, right? As Faisal Devji said recently, we need to think about Gandhi as a historical figure. What does it actually mean to invoke a historical figure like Gandhi? And you know, what is it? Is it productive to refer to him as racist? Is it productive to think about him in the ways that we do now, which is almost the other extreme? Certainly not productive to put him on a pedestal, which is pretty much what was happening before the 90s, right? And again, here's where it gets tricky and interesting. Like I said, a lot of different figures being pulled out, but fulfilling certainly different agendas, and we should be very clear on what that is, what those are. Okay, so today I think, and in some ways my thoughts on this are not finished thoughts. And that's why I had a lot of trouble putting all of this together. But we're faced with a kind of polyphonic situation, right? And there's one thing that is, I think, a big outcome of this kind of polyphony in these many voices in the historical space, in the history writing space, and so on, is that, in a way, the thing that we can't hold on to anymore, and this is the most troubling thing, is that single coherent narrative, right? That's gone. Now, what do we have to replace that? I interpret a lot of what's happening today simply as a search for a coherent narrative of the nation, right? And whether it's the attempt of Hindutva historians or whatever you call them, or anybody else, there is this search for a coherent narrative. And the question I have to my fellow panelists as well is, do we need it? In this day and age, do we actually need this coherent narrative? And to quote the theoretician you were talking about earlier, Mahmood, Hayden White, perhaps we require history that will educate us to discontinuity more than ever before, for discontinuity, disruption, and chaos is our lot. So I don't know what you will make of that, but in some ways, because we have so many voices and so much being said about history and so many people with historical projects of various kinds, alongside professional and academic history and, of course, your state history, in a way, I'm wondering whether, in fact, the trouble is we're looking for coherent narrative. Now, what do I do with all this in the classroom space? I wanted to bring it back to, sort of conclude with that. A prominent historian once came here to Jindal and said, and I won't name him, but he said that, somebody asked him about teaching history, and he said, when you enter the classroom, you have to leave your ideology behind and you have to teach the facts. And again, I'm going to just leave this open to say, as if we could, right? So then what does that mean for what we do in the classroom space? So for me, what, my kind of approach to this is to think, and I'm going to just cut through to the end, is to think about history as a mode of analysis. The research question part, of course, the evidence part, of course, the sense of time part, right? An argument that may not itself have stood the test of time. Our reading practice is to read closely, to critique our reading with as much depth as we can manage, and by critique, I don't mean demolition, right? But approaching a reading as an exercise in deep understanding of a text, even if we don't agree with it, right? So the multiplicity of viewpoints, both from these different authors, as well as in the classroom, are kept in place. They're kept alive, right? Even if they're viewpoints that I might not personally have particularly like, right? I think that that's my own take as a teacher. And connections are sought, right? What should not be the primary goal in my current understanding? I might have a different understanding next year. So I'm a work in progress. Narrative coherence is not the primary goal. The goal at the moment for us is, in fact, to disrupt, understand, be uncomfortable. The goal is to avoid black and white arguments, and this is, constantly I get asked this, but then what do we say about that? What's the final thing we say? The fact is, I don't know. We can't say a lot of final things about a lot of things. As Ravi was saying, we can say that this might have been probable, this might have been more likely than that, and these are the facts and the evidence to support that. But in fact, I think in this day and age, to make black and white conclusions about a lot of things is dangerous and difficult. And I also don't think it should be the expectation of history. What does history say about this? Well, history says this, and possibly that, right? So I think the avoidance of definitive answers is one of the things that I am currently at the moment thinking about. I have much more to say about various things, but I'm going to stop. I'm just going to end with a small provocation, as it were. So recently I was at this place called the Topography of Terror in Berlin. And in fact, Ruchi Joshi just had a little column on it somewhere in Telegraph or something. And what's interesting is that it's a museum about the Holocaust and the Nazi era on the ruins of the old SS building, which was demolished in 1945, or bombed out of existence in 1945. The wall is nearby. It's all very evocative as a space. And when you go inside, I was amazed at the graphic detail with which the Holocaust is laid out. The government, that is the Nazi regime, is talked about as a German regime. Of course, there's a great deal of time and distance. One could say there are problems with all this as well, as Hannah Arendt very evocatively points out in her now old but still very relevant book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. And then it also talks about it also thinks about the Nazi regime in terms of ideas. So what was their ideology of work and labor? And I was quite amazed by the whole presentation. And I was thinking, so sometimes certain kinds of public history projects can also be redemption. I'm just working with that idea. And what does that mean? I think that Dipesh Chakravarti was dealing with that also with regard to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. So what does it mean sometimes to also to face the difficult episodes in a communities or a societies or a nation's, dare I say it, history? And what does it mean to approach that head on? I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. I mean, this was so. I'm just maybe as a student of history, this was fascinating. We had some very, I would say, very enriching perspectives here. Questions. If you have observations, let's take the questions first and then move to observations. Otherwise, observations. Any question? I have a question to the panelists, but let me kind of collect and collate from others and then add my own projection. All right. Can we request students to go in first, if that's okay? All right. Please.
I'm not sure. First of all, thank you so much for a great presentation. history, but this is it's very informative that I'm thankful that I came here today. My question is actually directed to Professor Vitanti. Ma'am, so towards the end of your speech, you said something on the lines of how history demands a black and white argument or some sort of ending or some sort of final conclusion. But could you say something on the lines of why do we even require this black and white argument? To say that anything that happens in history, do you need to have something that concludes it? Can't you just leave it out in the open for debates and discussions? Why does it need to have this black and white to say that it can either go this side or this side? But why do we need to have that in place in the first place?
Alright, so that's one. I think you had a question.
My question is for Ravi sir. So you said some of our present policies are being dictated by the need to right the present wrongs. And then you gave the examples of the Babri Masjid and the caste-based reservation thing. So, but the caste-based reservation is not exactly a past wrong, it's a very present reality of our society. The caste-based discrimination, that's still happening. And when it comes to Babri Masjid, it is quite irrelevant, in my opinion, other than very communal political rhetoric that is being played in our country. So those are two very different examples. So that in...
Okay. So, alright.
Sir, you spoke about a grand theory as you spoke about a grand theory which is what is your definition of grand theory?
Okay, I think you can squeeze probably one more.
Yeah,
one more, and then that's so Mas, please.
My question was mainly for Gitanjali. I was just wondering, where do you envisage the space to not have a coherent history? Where would that space emerge? Like, is it in children's books which are not prescribed textbooks then? Because the prescribed textbook will, at least in the foreseeable future it seems, always be prescribed by the state. And the state will want a coherent narrative for the nation, probably, one way or another, depending on whoever's in power. So where will that space emerge for the non-coherent narrative of history, for children particularly?
Okay, so I'll also put in the question in the second round. I think let's have the panelists responding to these. You can go in the reverse order. Yeah, start in the reverse
So
order.
one to Nabami's question, actually Nabami, I was just trying to say that in fact we tend to overemphasize the desire for black and white argument, and even we guilty a little bit of this in academic history as well, that we want to put across the forceful argument and want to be known for that, and then but actually the historical evidence doesn't always bear that out very well. And then that's the point when you call them out on it, right? But the point, in fact, is that I think that as a result of the ways in which authority are laid out in our society, we tend to search for a black and white answer. And the search itself, I think, is the problem. Historians cannot actually, most of the time, in good conscience, and please everybody disagree with me, offer a black and white answer, especially to a very simple question simply put. At the same time, how do they prefer an answer that is not black and white, and would that be acceptable? Often it's not. I mean, in fact, the Babri Masjid issue really illustrates this, that they're simply being asked, so was there a Ram Mandir under that? And the answer is simply no. In good conscience, you can't say yes, right? But what is the importance of that and was that even the right question to ask necessarily? So this is the thing. So I agree with you that in fact we should not look for black and white answers. We should be very niche about it and look for the grays and try and figure out what are the probable, which direction can be tilted in terms of an answer, but not look for black and white. On the other question, actually, Maz, I'm still dealing with this. I think that storytelling is still really important, but I wonder if we can tell stories a little bit differently. So I was just thinking, about a book that you reviewed actually, the Jwala Kumar book, which I was reading to my child. And as I was reading it, I was thinking there is so much history here actually. It's not directly laid out in their face, but there's so much going on. And what that does is, and this is again going back to something that Ravi talked about, we also touched upon, what is the aesthetic quality of history, right? Where do we return a sense of wonder, a return of curiosity, a return of asking questions, a return of contemplation, and a return of pleasure to the act of learning about history? When do we? Somebody was written an Eon recently about the return of wonder and how we must. When did history stop becoming this thing where we try to imagine a different life and a different time? Actually, I think there are many ways in which we can get that across to students. But as long as there's a history textbook of the kind that we have, that these states tend to prescribe, in which someone is thrown in as a definitive guy and then somebody else is always a man, somebody else is thrown out as something else, I don't think we'll go there unless we continue to tell stories. That's, I think, not the case.
Alright. Just in case if you have any comments from the panelists as well. There's questions.
Well, regarding the question of caste-based reservations, I was not talking about caste-based reservations for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. I was only talking about the caste-based reservations for the other backward classes, and I was, giving my own memories of when it started, how it was difficult to make sense of it. Because you see, one thing, to the best of my knowledge, no historian has laid down or done a good amount of work on showing that the castes, or most of the castes, which are now grouped under this category of OBC, they have been historically oppressed or they have been historically discriminated against. Their case is fundamentally different from the case of SCs and STs, because in the case of SCs, it was demonstrably, oppression, exploitation, discrimination, etc., etc. And you see Gandhi, Ambedkar and all others who fought against untouchability and against this discrimination were absolutely in the right for doing that. And that is why there was a consensus in our society and among the elite and founding fathers that special measures have to be taken, because without special measures these people cannot be uplifted, justice has to be done to them. The society owes it to them. Now, so it was an extraordinary measure that was taken, to give historical compensation to a group that was without dispute, exploited, oppressed, discriminated against, relegated to the bottom of the society, treated in an inhuman, subhuman, whatever you call it, manner. This is one thing. Now, the case of the OBCs must not be clubbed with the case of SCs at all. First of all, OBC is an artificial category which was created by the Mandal report. It is not something that naturally exists. You see, in the case of the SCs, there is a natural existence in the sense that all SCs across India, no matter what caste they belong to, they were treated as untouchables. The essential criteria for being considered scheduled caste was that you should be treated as untouchable by the society. So it was a clearly important social and cultural category, which is not so in the case of the OBCs. Now, what is the comparison between a Yadav of Uttar Pradesh and a Mallah of Uttar Pradesh? If you know about the society of UP or any other place, you would know very well that there is no comparison at all in terms of their economic position, their social position, their political position, etc., etc. It is a totally artificially created category. And when we try to, you see, now you may be, when you say that we are talking about the present, I'll come to that question again. But the fact is that reservation was given to them and it is defended even today in the name of 5,000 years oppression to the OBC. No, where is that 5,000 years oppression? Is there any historical evidence for it? These were the locally dominant peasant groups. They were educationally backward, because one thing that we don't understand is that education was not valued in the pre-modern world the way it is valued today. By the way, let me tell you one thing. That in Indian culture and civilization, providing gyan to somebody without his asking you was regarded as a very, very bad thing. So gyan was something that you provided to somebody only when he came to you. The learned never went to to the society distributing gyan. No. Imparting knowledge, no. And that is why only certain groups which were focused on learning, they were the ones who were ahead of others in education. And let me tell you one thing, this domination in jobs by certain upper caste groups, especially by Brahmins, is a modern phenomenon. It happened in the last 200 years because Brahmins took advantage of British education system. They were the first to get educated, more than anyone else, and they acquired this dominance in jobs, which was naturally resented by other groups. For example, in the South, I can very well understand that. But if you look at administration, say Mughal administration or the administration of other states, you don't find such a domination by the Brahmins or even by other castes for that matter. So it is a modern thing which you are trying to now reverse. And when you say that there was historical discrimination against the other backward classes like castes like Yadav, Kurmi, Lo, the Jat, Maratha, and so on and so forth. What is the historical evidence for it? Is there any historical evidence? There is none. And second, if you talk about the present, even in the present, I have I'm a contemporary of Gitanjali, so I remember things from the 1980s very well, and I can tell you that even in cities, in cities and villages everywhere, these groups were not regarded as low in any sense. They were not regarded, they were not oppressed or discriminated against in any manner whatsoever. But there is a politics that goes into that creation of the past or creation of history. And I have seen, how historical narratives have changed in my own lifetime. In 1986, when Jagjeevan Ram died, I remember that incident very, very well, very clearly. In 1986, Jagjeevan Ram died, and everybody said, newspapers said this, Doordarshan said it, and people said this, that the tallest leader of the Harijans has died. Nobody even talked about Ambedkar when Jagjeevan Ram died. This is what the truth is. Ambedkar has become a leader before my eyes. I'm not trying to say that Ambedkar had done nothing, by the way. That's not the point. But the way historical narratives change, you can see in your own lifetime. Ambedkar was nowhere. In fact, he was just a name, in the 1980s, in the textbooks and in popular memory. And then when the anti-Congress parties started rising, they started using the name of Ambedkar in order to counter Jagjeevan Ram's narrative that Jagjeevan Ram was the tallest Harijan leader, and then Bharat Ratna was given to him, and then from the 90s you see that shift in favor of Ambedkar, and now as she says that Ambedkar has been put on a pedestal and all kinds of things are being attributed to him, and on the other hand Gandhi and many other people are being unfairly attacked. So the comparison that I made was not wrong at all. In fact, what I was trying to say was that it is really hazardous to invoke the past in order to justify things in the present. Because one, historical evidence is a very, very tricky thing. It's not a black and white thing in most cases. Like she cited that case of how historians gave evidence in the Babri Masjid case. Two of the historians, they were my teachers, they had taught me, Shrin Ratnagar and Surya Jaiswal. Both very good teachers. Surya Jaiswal was a historian of ancient India, Shrin Ratnagar is an archaeologist. But if you are asked in a court of law, now many of you are being trained as lawyers, if you are asked in a court of law, pinpointed questions, as a historian, can you really give black and white answers to those questions? Now you are asked, what is your specialization? You say ancient history. Then the next question the judge or the lawyer asks you, within ancient history, what is your specialization? Fine, you are an archaeologist. Are you a field archaeologist? No, I am not a field archaeologist. Are you a marine archaeologist within that? Okay. Do you specialize in the archaeology of the medieval period? Do you specialize in the archaeology of the Mughals? There can be 20 questions from the point of view of law, but historians are not equipped to answer those questions. You see, their understanding is a proximate understanding of what past might have been like. It is not a black and white thing, it is not something that exists in certitude. And therefore, the argument I was giving was that it is probably futile and dangerous. In order to defend our values in the present, whatever these values are, whether it is protection of minority rights, or the protection of monuments, or the protection of any other, our liberties, etc., etc., it is inherently dangerous to go to the past, because the past can throw up evidence of all kinds. If you go to the past, then be ready for contest. Then you cannot turn back and say that, look, this is what I will accept, but I will not accept that. It is in that sense that I had compared this Babri Masjid thing to the OBC reservation, because even to this day it is said that, you did oppression and therefore you have to pay for it. I have heard it 1,000 times, in fact. I cannot say that it does not exist. And the only reason I brought up this topic here, because it is a different kind of audience. Probably you cannot speak so openly about it in another forum. She was talking about the 90s in JNU. I remember very well, Arun Shori had written this book, Worshipping False Gods. He was invited to JNU and his face was blackened. In a place like that, he was not allowed to speak. So if you have a different perspective, and you want people to be tolerant, it's not always easy, because the fact is that people are tolerant as long as your perspective falls within a certain ambit. When it goes beyond that, it's very, very difficult. So this OBC thing is not comparable to the SC thing, to the SC reservation, and two, certainly neither in the past nor in the present were they a historically oppressed community. Reservation is something that constitutionally, legally, philosophically, morally is reserved for people who are clearly, undisputedly, you can say, discriminated against and oppressed. For example, the blacks in America, who are clearly the descendants of the slaves who were brought over, or the scheduled castes in India who are clearly discriminated against. The moment we say that we are going to right all the historical wrongs, you see, there are many historical wrongs. For example, women have been wronged in history, various groups have been wronged in history. There is no end to it actually. All kinds of, within Islam also, many groups have been wronged. For example, the lower strata of society, within Hindu society, groups have been wronged. So there has been exploitation, there has been discrimination, but unless it is a case of gross exploitation, clear, undisputed discrimination, oppression, compensatory action, should not take place. This is what I was trying to suggest. And that is why it is dangerous to invoke the past and to say that we have to, right the historical wrongs, because history is ultimately history. Past is a country that you cannot visit. There is a limit beyond which you cannot actually change even the present. Leave aside the past. The past cannot be changed. It should be accepted in a gracious manner, with all its nuances, with all its complexities, with all its grey areas. But the problem is that we keep invoking the past in order to settle our scores in the present. As she said rightly, that history is always political. I am not saying that there is no political tinge to it. But when it becomes clearly political in this sense, that it is only a certain version of history, not even based on evidence, that you want to become legitimate or that you want to popularize, it becomes problematic. In that sense, we have to continue to be old-fashioned historians who are concerned with evidence. So I will ask you about evidence. Is there any evidence that the OBCs were discriminated against or oppressed? Rather, they were, most of them, they were dominant sections of the society. Certainly not. They were educationally backward, because most communities were educationally backward. Education was not valued in the pre-modern society the way you are valued, the way it is valued today. Therefore, don't project the present into the past and think that something is important in the present and therefore it would have been important in the past as well. Second question, yes. Oh, the grand theory. I'm sorry, I have taken.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Actually, bullets to one thing. My only concern is there are a couple of questions.